We're going to show two demos that have been rolled up into one to show how a developer may interact with OpenShift, as well as a CI/CD pipeline flow that might ensue following the developer checking in their code. In this demo there are two personas. First of all, a developer who's coding and testing in OpenShift, as well as in their IDE. And secondly, a CI/CD admin who, for simplicity, also pushes code to production, though in reality these roles would likely be separated. So here you can see the developer who has their IDE, in our case VS Code. They check out code, make a change, then test it on a developer sandbox type of area on OpenShift. This is restricted and cannot interact with anybody else's work. There are two advantages to developers having this. First, it lets them test out their code in an identical environment to the test environments and also production. And test things like config maps are injecting correctly, OpenShift builds and deployments are behaving as expected, and in short, to eliminate the "it works on my laptop" syndrome. And secondly, they'll have access to a self-service playground containing many runtimes, databases, servers, tools, etc. Studies have found that high-performing IT organizations typically give developers self-service access to components to experiment and ultimately to innovate. So in our demo, they'll use a simple developer-focused command line interface called ODO or OpenShift Do, where they push their work to this sandbox and test it out. You can see that on the left-hand side. Then following, once they're happy with their work, they'll push their code into source control on an OpenShift-based Git server called GOGS, which will trigger a CI/CD pipeline flow. Jenkins is the CI/CD engine that we'll use. OpenShift works very well with external source control systems like GitLab, TeamCity, and others. So they'll push their code using a git commit, as you can see here. So you can see here the elements of the CI/CD pipeline. It first builds a binary artifact. It performs unit tests, code analysis tests using SonarQube, then archives the artifact in Nexus. It then uses a neat OpenShift specific utility called source to image, or S2I, where it overlays our code onto a base image to create an application image, removing the need and the security hole that is sometimes associated with building images using Docker syntax. It's then available to test out in our dev environment. That's different obviously to our developer sandbox that we saw earlier. This one is part of the CI/CD environments. Once the release manager or whoever makes the final check has done so, has pushed our final code into our final staging environment, that's the end of the CI/CD pipeline flow, and obviously that could be swapped into production using blue-green, for example. We can see the image repository key or quay on the bottom here. It's a simple step to include it, but for time reasons we've omitted it. See the link on the bottom left-hand side of the slide for how to run this demo, including key. Okay, so let's switch to our demo. So you can see here, in Chrome I'm logged in as an administrator, and this is my CI/CD project. It contains various elements that we spoke about earlier: the GOGS source control, Git-based source control system, Jenkins for CI/CD, Nexus as our repository for both image and binary artifacts, and SonarQube for code analysis. Though, as we mentioned, OpenShift is very flexible in terms of which implementations you use for these responsibilities. If we switch to our source control system, GOGS, it's a very simple Git type of interface. But I'd just like to point out here that it's got a webhook that you can see here on screen that will fire to start the pipeline on code commit. You can see that it's going to start this tasks pipeline. We also have two versions of our application only available to administrative users. A dev environment, first of all, which is the first environment in our CI/CD flow after our unit tests and our code analysis have been done. It's going to get pushed to here. And we also have a stage environment, which is our final environment. The only thing that we're going to change is a simple update to the number 12 that you can see here. So if we switch across to Firefox, we can see that we're logged into the same cluster, this time into this developer sandbox. Logged in as a developer, Tom Dev. We just have a couple of namespaces, Che and Kafka, as well as an empty namespace, tasks here, for our featured tasks application, the one that we're going to be working with. Next, we're going to switch over to VS Code and kick off the developer interaction demo. The first thing that we'll do is in our terminal here inside VS Code, we're going to clone our repo from our source code from the GOGS repo that you saw earlier running in OpenShift. After I've done that, I'm going to make a very small change to my web interface, and you saw that we had the number 12 earlier on our web page. We're going to update that to 13. But before we commit it into source control, we want to test it out inside of our developer sandbox, and that's what we're going to do next. So after we've done that, we're going to do a build, just Maven build to reflect the changes that we've just made. We use our developer-focused command line tool called ODO. It's a very simple CLI tool that just allows developers to log into a cluster, push their changes up, expose a URL, watch for changes, etc. And we're going to use a few of those commands. So we're now using our Tom's task namespace, and we're ready to push our changes up to OpenShift. So that's going to run for a minute, and we're going to pause the recording. Now we can see a couple of minutes later, our build process and our push to our local sandbox through ODO has completed. It first of all has built the binary artifact locally, and then has pushed that up to our OpenShift server, done our source to image, overlaying our own application, this tasks application, onto the base image, which is the Wildfly or the Enterprise JBoss EAP, and then has created an application for us. It's given us a path here, and to that path we're going to append, it's given us a host, and we're going to append the OpenShift tasks path to that. That should be available in the moment, and you can see that it has reflected our update source to the number 13, which used to be 12. So now let's assume that we're happy with our local testing inside of our sandbox, and we want to push our code into Git. So I'm just going to use the CLI, the Git CLI again, to push that up. Now what we want to do is we want to watch our OpenShift cluster and our CI/CD pipeline. So we switch back to our admin view, and we move down to our builds, and we can see that just on my commit less than a minute ago, we've got a pipeline build running. So if we look here, you can see this build has started, and just to recap what happens on that, I'll just show you the slide again that shows the contents of this particular pipeline flow. On commit, it first of all builds the war file, the binary artifact, performs unit tests, code analysis with Sonar Cube, pushes that into a local Nexus repository, which again is running inside of our cluster here, and then it builds an image and pushes that into our dev environment. We can test it out then in our dev environment, and then we can, following that, it will run our integration tests, and then at that point we as the administrator, or taking on the persona of the release manager, can make the final check and then push that to our staging environment, which, as we mentioned, through blue-green could actually be swapped into production. So let's see how we're getting on with our build. Swap across here. You see that's done most of the stages of our pipeline. A couple of minutes later, our application is now has now been pushed through the development environment. So if you reflect here, this should go up to 13, reflecting our the change that we've made and we've committed, which triggered off the pipeline. And if we then switch across, we are now prompted to approve this change. We can log in using our OpenShift credentials as kubeadmin into OpenShift. And now we're presented with the familiar Jenkins environment here, and it's paused for input. So we go ahead, and assuming that we're happy, we just promote this into our test environment, which, if we switch back here, is now deploying into our staging environment. That one is very quick. And now, after we've promoted our application into our staging environment, it just takes a few seconds to deploy into stage. And if I hit my staging URL here, you can see that it also is reflecting the change to 13. Thanks for watching the demo.